Today, we will be reading a narrative poem called Birches. A birch is a type of tree that you can take a look at the picture off to the left. As we read this poem together, notice how the author is using it to tell us a story. Our focus for reading today is to identify the key details in the text to form a main idea. A little helpful hint is that a main idea is what the text is mostly or mainly about. Details are used to help support your main idea. What is poetry? Poetry is a piece of writing written by an author called a poet. But what is the purpose of poetry? A poem is written using rhythm, rhyme, and other artistic language to show feelings and emotions. It's often short, but some poets write long poems too. Rhythm and rhyme are a part of many poems. Rhythm is the beat or sound pattern of a poem. Lots of poets use repetition and similar word sounds to create the beat or rhythm. Here's an example. A candy bar, a piece of cake, a lollipop, a chocolate shake. Many poems that have rhythm also have rhyme. Rhyme is having the same sound at the end of two or more words, like bike, hike, and rad, dad. Our poem from earlier has rhyme with the words cake and shake, and it makes me feel hungry. Another common element of poetry is alliteration. Alliteration is when the consonant sound is repeated at the beginning of words. Like Tracy the tiger made a terrifying sound. There are many types of poems that poets write. Some common poems are acrostic, couplet, haiku, limerick, narrative, free verse, humorous, and lyrical. A narrative poem tells a story. There are characters, problems, solutions, and a beginning, middle, and end. Before we start reading our poem, I do want to point out a few things before we start. If you notice, off to the left-hand side are tiny numbers that are written next to certain parts in our poem. Poems are broken down into stanzas, so not necessarily paragraphs. Then each part or line of a poem isn't called a sentence like in regular stories or text. So if I want to look for line 6, I would first find the stanza 5 number. So I would look at the little 5 and then go one more down, and that is line 6. So that's why this poem looks a little different than our typical text that we've read so far. So follow along as I read Birches by Robert Frost. When I see birches bend to left and right across the lines of straighter, darker trees, I like to think some boy's been swinging them. But swinging doesn't bend them down to stay as ice storms do. Often you must have seen them, loaded with ice a sunny winter morning after a rain. They click upon themselves as the breezes rise and turn many-colored, as the stir cracks and crazes their enamel. Soon the sun's warmth makes them shed crystal shells, shattering and avalanching on the snow crust. Such heaps of broken glass to sweep away, you'd think the inner dome of heaven had fallen. They are dragged to the withered bracken by the load, and they seem not to break, though once they are bowed, so low for long, they never right themselves. You may see their trunks arching in the woods years afterwards, trailing their leaves on the ground, like girls on hands and knees that throw their hair before them over their heads to dry the sun. But I was going to say, when truth broke in with all her matter of fact about the ice storm, I should prefer to have some boy bend them as he went out and in to fetch the cows. some boy too far from town to learn baseball, whose only play was what he found himself. Summer or winter he could play alone. One by one he subdued his father's tree by writing them down over and over again. All right, how did we do with this poem? Now, I'm going to be honest. Sometimes poem, for me personally, can be a little difficult to understand. That's why I always like to reread poems over and over until I start connecting the pieces into my head. If you need to, feel free to go back to the previous slide to re-listen to the poem to see if you can understand it a bit more. However, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try my best to analyze this poem to the best of my ability. So one thing I first noticed in line 1 was that the poet mentions that he sees birches or these trees bend to the left and right. So I'm already thinking, okay, what does he mean by that? These birches are kind of bent to the left and the right. So I kind of underlined that because I thought that that would be just a question that I could come back to. Then in line 3, I noticed that he said that he would rather think that some boy's been swinging them. So I had a picture in my head when I read that line. I kind of pictured that, just children, either there's a swing attached to the tree or they're just kind of, hanging on to the tree and swinging left and right. So now I'm kind of gathering just that information already and understanding that, okay, these trees, these birches are bent, and the author wants to think or hopes that it's because these boys or children have been outside playing on them. So I'm already kind of putting my puzzle pieces together. However, if we look at line 5 now, we understand that the reason that the birches are bent is not because the boys have been swinging on them, but because of these ice storms. So what I'm noticing, I'm taking all of that information, and my snippet off to the side says, we see here that the author explains the birches are bent because of the ice or snow weighing down on them. So I'm just picturing maybe observations I might have seen in my own backyard. Sometimes when we get very heavy snow, I notice that some of my branches on my tree, they start to bend a little just because the snow is heavy. So I'm making all of those connections just to help me understand this poem a bit more. Jumping down to lines 11 through 24, this was just a nice part in our poem where the author is just using great details to describe the effects the birch or the ice has on the birches. So it's not necessarily details that I need, but it was just very good details. Then continuing on, again, we realize that this author or this poet just loves nature and enjoys nature. And just like John Burroughs, I feel like he wants people to, share that experience. So he really wishes that these boys or children would be the reason why these trees were bending, because they were outside in nature, playing with nature, swinging on the trees. So that's just something that I underline again because that just reconfirms what we annotated in our first couple of lines in this poem. So based off what we read so far, my interpretation of the poem, as well as the details that we underline, I'm going to use it to now form myself a main idea. This poem is mainly about how the poet wishes that the reason why the birches are bent are because children are outside enjoying nature. Now, again, let me remind you that when you were thinking about the main idea in your own head, it might have sounded pretty different than what I wrote, and that's okay. However, I hope that they were similar in the concept, that you thought that, the trees were being bent because of the children. So although our words might be different, we want to make sure that our overall main idea and topic is pretty much similar. You are practically a poet. Tomorrow we will finish the last half of our poem together.